Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's case, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Now let's get into the story. The wind howled through the dense pine forest, making the cabin creak as though it were alive, groaning under the weight of the storm. Inside, the small wood-burning stove crackled softly, casting a warm, amber glow around the single room. The fire was the only comfort I had out here, miles from any trace of civilization. My breath fogged up in front of me, a reminder that even inside, the cold was ever present, nipping at my skin beneath the flannel blanket draped over my shoulders. I hadn't come to the cabin by choice. No one in their right mind would willingly spend time out here alone, especially in weather like this. But I needed the break. No, I needed the escape. Work had been relentless, and the suffocating city crowds weren't doing my anxiety any favors. I figured a weekend in the Colorado wilderness, cut off from the world, might be the reset I desperately needed. With the fire stoked and the stove packed, I settled into the rickety old armchair facing the window. Outside, the darkness was absolute. The night had swallowed everything beyond the immediate yard, save for the occasional gust of wind that stirred the snow on the ground. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, though I already knew what I'd see. No service, of course. That was the whole point, wasn't it? To disconnect, to get away from the constant stream of notifications, emails, and messages. I tossed the phone onto the small wooden table beside me and sighed. As the wind picked up again, I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the fire seep into my bones. The silence was unnerving, though. Even the wind, with all its force, couldn't quite mask the eerie stillness of the place. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. A loud crack from outside jolted me upright. My eyes snapped open, heart racing. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. The wind had been so loud all night. Surely it was just a branch breaking under the weight of the snow. But then there it was again, another sharp crack, closer this time. My pulse quickened as I strained to listen. Nothing, just the wind. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself. "It's nothing, John," I whispered under my breath. "Just the wind, or maybe a tree fell." I stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. The firelight reflected off the glass, making it hard to see much beyond the faint outline of the trees. The night swallowed everything. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow, and it annoyed me. I had come out here to find peace, not to let my mind play tricks on me. Yet, something felt wrong. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier, as if the walls were closing in. Another crash, this one much louder and unmistakably close. It wasn't a tree falling. It sounded like something, or someone, had just smashed through the brush not far from the cabin. My hands clenched into fists, my mind racing. Who the hell would be out here at this time of night? I grabbed the small flashlight from the table and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, but it did little to calm my nerves. I stepped cautiously toward the front door, listening for any sign of movement outside. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking in the silence. "Is anyone out there?" No answer, just the wind. I cursed under my breath and tightened my grip on the flashlight. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or something, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I had packed a small hunting knife in my duffel bag, more out of habit than necessity, and suddenly I regretted not having it on me. I turned back to the door, intending to retrieve the knife, when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and slow, crunching through the snow just outside the cabin. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, and I forced myself to breathe quietly. The footsteps stopped just outside the front door. The wooden boards of the porch groaned under the weight of whatever was out there. "Who's there?" I asked again, louder this time, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Silence. No movement. Just the sound of my own shallow breathing. I took a step back, my eyes locked on the door. It was flimsy, an old wooden thing that probably couldn't stand up to much force. If someone wanted in, it wouldn't take much. Just as the thought crossed my mind, the doorknob rattled. It was slight, but enough to send a jolt of terror through me. Someone, or something, was trying to get inside. Without thinking, I dashed across the room, grabbed the knife from my bag, and held it in front of me, my hands trembling. The flashlight beam shook as I pointed it toward the door. The rattling stopped for a moment, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then, with a deafening crack, the door splintered inward. A massive force hit it from the outside, sending wood and metal flying across the room. The The door barely hung on its hinges as the thing outside forced its way in. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight as it clattered to the floor. The fire's light flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows around the room. In the doorway, I could just make out a hulking figure, standing at least 7 feet tall. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, and my stomach twisted in fear. What the hell are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. It stepped inside the cabin, its massive form almost filling the doorway. The smell hit me first, a sickening stench of rot and decay. I gagged, backing up further until I was pressed against the far wall. It let out a low, guttural growl, its breath coming in heavy, raspy bursts. I could see its fur, thick, matted, and covered in what looked like dried blood. I held the knife out in front of me, though I knew it was a pitiful defense against whatever this thing was. My mind raced for answers, but none came. All I knew was that I had to survive. Somehow, I had to get out of this alive. As it moved closer, I saw its eyes more clearly. They were dark, almost black, but there was something else there, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just an animal. It was something far worse, something that shouldn't exist. It lunged at me, its claws slashing through the air. I barely managed to dodge to the side, stabbing blindly with the knife. I felt the blade connect with something solid, and the creature let out a roar of pain. I didn't wait to see what kind of damage I'd done. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the back of the cabin, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Behind me, I heard it crash into the furniture, sending the table and chairs flying. It wasn't done with me yet. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, barely attached after the impact, swaying as the cold wind howled through the gaping hole left behind. Splinters and shattered wood littered the floor, and the faint glow from the fire barely illuminated the beast standing just inside the cabin. My mind was screaming at me to move, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. All I could do was stare, frozen, as the massive figure blocked my escape route. The stench was overwhelming, a mix of wet fur and rot so thick I could taste it. I gagged, trying to swallow down the bile rising in my throat. It took another step forward, the floorboards creaking under its immense weight. I could hear its heavy breathing now, like a series of low growls, each one vibrating in the air. This thing wasn't just an animal, it was something far worse. In a moment of clarity, I realized I still had the knife gripped tightly in my hand. My knuckles were white, the handle slick with sweat. I knew it wouldn't be enough to kill something this big, but I had no choice. It was either fight or die. I took a step back, my eyes never leaving the creature. Its head was massive, covered in thick, matted fur that hung down like an animal left too long in the wild. Its eyes were deep set, glowing faintly in the dim light like burning embers, full of something dark, something not quite right. There was no intelligence there, no reasoning, just pure primal rage. It let out a low, rumbling growl, and then, without warning, it lunged at me. I barely had time to react as it crossed the distance between us in a single stride. I swung the knife wildly, the blade slicing through the air as I tried to defend myself. I felt the impact as it hit something solid, its arm maybe, but the creature barely seemed to register the wound. Its claws raked across my chest, and I felt a sharp, burning pain shoot through my body. The force of the blow sent me stumbling backward, crashing into the wall behind me. The knife slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. I gasped, trying to catch my breath as I pressed a hand to my chest. The pain was intense, like someone had lit my skin on fire, but I couldn't stop to think about it. I had to survive. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice hoarse and shaky. I reached for the knife, but the creature was already on top of me again, its claws slashing wildly. I rolled to the side just in time, narrowly avoiding another strike. The table splintered under its weight as it crashed down, sending pieces of wood flying across the room. It was relentless, driven by some instinct I couldn't understand. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the knife again and raising it defensively. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I could hear its growls, low and menacing, filling the small cabin with a sound that chilled me to the bone. I knew I couldn't keep dodging forever. I needed to fight back. I needed to hurt it. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I lunged forward, thrusting the knife into its side. The blade sank deep into the thick fur, hitting muscle and bone. The creature howled in pain, a deafening roar that reverberated through the cabin. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something like fear in its eyes. It staggered back, clutching at the wound with its massive hand, blood seeping through its fur. But even wounded, it wasn't done. It let out another roar and swiped at me, its claws connecting with my arm. I screamed as the claws tore through my skin, leaving deep, jagged gashes that immediately began to bleed. My vision blurred from the pain, but I forced myself to stay upright. "Get away from me!" I yelled, though my voice wavered with fear. I slashed at the creature again, this time aiming for its face. The blade grazed its cheek, cutting through the fur and leaving a bloody line across its skin. The beast reared back, snarling and swiping at the air. I stumbled backward, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. My back hit the wall, and I realized with a sickening dread that I was cornered. There was nowhere left to go. The creature loomed over me, its breath hot and foul as it stared down at me with those burning eyes. For a moment, we both stood there, locked in a deadly standoff. My breathing was ragged, and my arm throbbed with pain, blood dripping onto the floor. I could see the creature's chest rising and falling, its breathing heavy and labored. It was hurt, but it wasn't done, not by a long shot. You're not real," I whispered, half to myself, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the pain in my arm, the blood on the floor, the deep gouges in the walls, they were all too real. This thing, whatever it was real. It lunged at me again, but this time I was ready. I ducked to the side, narrowly avoiding its claws, and drove the knife deep into its side once more. The creature let out a high-pitched scream, a sound so inhuman it made my skin crawl. It staggered back, clutching at the wound, blood pouring from the gash. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for the door, adrenaline surging through my veins. My hands fumbled with the handle for a split second before I managed to yank the door open. I stumbled outside into the freezing night air, the cold biting into my skin as I sprinted away from the cabin. Behind me, I heard the creature crash through the doorway, its roars echoing through the forest. I glanced back and saw its massive silhouette standing in the doorway, watching me with those burning eyes. But it didn't follow. It stood there, panting and growling, its eyes locked on me as I disappeared into the darkness. I ran as fast as I could, the cold air burning my lungs, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Away from that thing, away from the cabin, away from whatever nightmare I had just lived through. After what felt like hours, I finally collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. My arm throbbed painfully, and I could feel the warmth of blood soaking through my sleeve. But I was alive. Somehow I had survived. I looked back toward the cabin, now barely visible in the distance. The beast was gone, but the memory of its glowing eyes, its snarls, and its claws would be with me forever. "Jesus Christ," I muttered, leaning my head back against the tree. What the hell was that thing? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I needed to get as far away from this place as possible before it came back. My chest heaved as I pressed myself against the thick tree trunk, trying to steady my breathing. The adrenaline that had driven me this far was fading, leaving me trembling in the freezing cold. The weight of the night, what had just happened, settled on me like a thick, suffocating blanket. The thing had slashed across my arm with its claws, leaving deep gashes that now burned like fire. I winced, gripping the wound with my free hand, trying to stop the bleeding. My sleeve was soaked in blood, the fabric clinging to my skin. I knew I needed to find help, but the nearest town was hours away on foot, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the beast was still watching me from the darkness. I had to keep moving, no matter how much pain I was in. If I stayed in one place for too long, it would find me again. That much I was certain of. Pushing myself off the tree, I started walking. Every step was agony. My muscles ached, my head throbbed, and my vision blurred from exhaustion and blood loss. But the fear kept me going. It was a primal, desperate fear, the kind that gnaws at your sanity until it's all you can think about. I heard a noise behind me, a faint rustle, like something large shifting through the underbrush. My heart jumped into my throat. Was it back? Had it followed me after all? I spun around, gripping the knife tightly in my good hand, my eyes scanning the dark forest. "Come on," I muttered under my breath, my voice trembling. "Show yourself, you bastard." The wind rustled through the trees, but there was no sign of the creature. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was out there, watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I stumbled forward, determined to keep going. The pain in my arm was unbearable now, every heartbeat sending a fresh wave of agony through my body. I pressed the fabric of my torn jacket against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. I needed a tourniquet, but there was no time to stop and fashion one. Suddenly I heard it again, a low growl, closer this time. My heart raced, and I whipped around, the knife trembling in my grip. The trees loomed like shadows, twisting and shifting in the dark, but there was nothing there. Nothing but that terrible, suffocating quiet. "I know you're there," I whispered, barely loud enough for even myself to hear. The wind howled through the pines, and for a moment, it was all I could hear. Then, from the darkness, the beast appeared again. It wasn't running this time. It wasn't charging at me like before. Instead, it moved slowly, deliberately, stalking me like prey. Its hulking body moved with surprising grace through the forest, barely making a sound. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across its matted fur. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, fixed on me with that same malevolent hunger. "Stay back," I warned, my voice shaking as I held the knife in front of me. It growled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Then it lunged. I barely had time to react. I swung the knife blindly, hoping to hit something, anything, to keep it away from me. The blade connected with its arm, slicing through the thick fur and into the flesh beneath. The creature howled in pain, but it didn't stop. Its claws lashed out, catching me across the chest. The impact knocked me off my feet, sending me sprawling to the ground. I gasped as the pain shot through my body, my chest burning from the fresh wounds. The creature loomed over me, snarling and baring its sharp teeth. I could feel its hot breath on my face, the stench of decay overwhelming. I had seconds to act before it tore me apart. Without thinking, I rolled to the side and thrust the knife upward with all the strength I had left. The blade sank deep into the creature's side, and it let out a deafening roar. It reared back, clutching at the wound, giving me just enough time to scramble to my feet. I backed away, panting, my hands slick with blood, both mine and the creature's. The beast stumbled, its movements sluggish now as it tried to pull the knife from its side. It let out another growl, but this one was weaker, pained. "Come on," I muttered, barely able to stand myself. "Just die already." The creature locked eyes with me, and for a brief moment, I thought it would collapse. But instead, it let out a final, furious roar and charged again. This time, I wasn't quick enough. Its massive body slammed into me, knocking the wind from my lungs and sending me crashing into a tree. My vision went white from the pain as I crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath. I could feel its claws digging into my shoulder, pinning me to the ground. I thrashed beneath it, trying to fight back, but I was too weak. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. "Get off me!" I screamed, panic surging through me as I tried to push the creature away. But it was too strong. Its weight crushed me, and I could feel my ribs straining under the pressure. In a last desperate effort, I reached for the knife still lodged in its side. My fingers brushed against the hilt, but I couldn't get a grip on it. The creature snarled again, lowering its massive head toward mine. I could see its teeth now, yellowed and sharp, inches from my face. This was it. This was how I was going to die. But then, just as suddenly as it had attacked, the creature let out a pained howl and recoiled, its body shaking. I gasped for air, barely able to comprehend what was happening. It staggered back, clawing at the knife still embedded in its side. Blood poured from the wound, soaking the ground beneath it. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both of us gasping for breath. Then, with one last, agonized growl, the creature turned and fled into the darkness, crashing through the trees as it disappeared into the forest. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, too stunned to move, too exhausted to even think. The pain in my chest and arm throbbed relentlessly, but I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had survived. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, staring up at the night sky through the canopy of trees. My breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, each one a reminder that I was still here, still breathing. But the creature was gone. For now. I slowly pulled myself to my feet, using the tree for support. My legs felt like jelly, and my chest ached with every movement. I had to get back to the cabin, had to find some way to stop the bleeding before I passed out. I couldn't stay out here, not with that thing still out there, wounded and angry. As I limped back toward the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The creature would return. It wasn't done with me yet. And next time, I might not be so lucky. The cold air bit at my skin as I staggered back toward the cabin, every step a struggle against the stabbing pain in my chest and the throbbing gashes in my arm. My breath came in short, desperate gasps, the icy wind burning my lungs as I moved through the dark forest. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie silver light over the landscape, but it offered little comfort. All I could think about was the creature, its eyes, its claws, the way it had looked at me before it fled into the trees. I glanced over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. The forest was quiet now, too quiet, as if even the animals knew something terrible lurked just beyond the trees. When I finally reached the cabin, I nearly collapsed against the doorframe. the weight of the night pressing down on me. The door was shattered, barely hanging on its hinges, the wood splintered and broken where the creature had forced its way inside. I pushed the door open, stumbling into the dark, cold interior. The fire had died down to embers, and the room was plunged into shadows. I slammed the door behind me, as if that could somehow keep the creature out. My hand fumbled for the lock, even though I knew it was useless now. The door had been wrecked beyond repair, but it was all I had to feel even a semblance of safety. Leaning against the wall, I tried to catch my breath, but the pain in my chest and arm made it nearly impossible. My hands shook as I peeled off the torn fabric of my jacket, revealing the deep gashes left by the creature's claws. Blood soaked the material, and my skin was cold and clammy beneath it. I winced as I pressed a hand to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. I needed to bandage myself up, but my mind was spinning, and I couldn't focus on anything except the thought of that thing returning. It had been wounded, yes, but it wasn't dead. It had looked at me before it fled, and there was no doubt in my mind that it would come back for me. A sudden, loud creak from outside made me jump. My heart pounded in my chest, and I clutched the knife tighter, my eyes darting toward the broken door. No, 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 I muttered under my breath, trying to steady myself. Please, not again. I stepped cautiously toward the door, holding the knife out in front of me. The room was quiet again, but that didn't mean anything. The creature was smart, it had stalked me before, and it could be waiting just outside, ready to strike the moment I let my guard down. I reached the door and peered out into the darkness. The wind rustled through the trees, and the snow-covered ground glistened faintly in the moonlight. There was no sign of the creature, no movement, no sound. Just the quiet, empty forest. I let out a shaky breath, lowering the knife slightly. Maybe it was gone for good. Maybe the wounds I'd inflicted were enough to drive it away. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wasn't true. That thing wasn't going to give up so easily. It was out there somewhere, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I stepped back from the door and turned my attention to the room. It was a mess, furniture overturned, bloodstains smeared across the floor, and the remnants of the broken door scattered in pieces. The fire had nearly died out, leaving only a faint, glowing ember in the stove. I needed warmth. I needed light. I limped toward the stove, grabbing a few pieces of wood from the pile beside it and tossing them into the flames. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped them, but I managed to get the fire going again, the flames slowly licking up the sides of the logs. As the fire grew brighter, the room filled with a dim orange glow, and I collapsed onto the nearest chair, my body aching with exhaustion. My mind was racing, going over the events of the night again and again. How had it found me? What was it? No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't come up with any answers that made sense. The image of its eyes, those deep, burning eyes, haunted me. There had been something behind them, something more than just instinct or animalistic rage. It was as though the creature had a purpose, a reason for attacking me. But what could it possibly want? The wind outside picked up again, rattling the remaining window panes in the cabin. I flinched at the sound, gripping the knife tighter. Every noise seemed louder, every shadow more threatening. I felt like prey, hunted and cornered, waiting for the inevitable. Then, in the silence, I heard it again, the heavy, deliberate sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. My heart stopped, and I held my breath listening. The footsteps grew louder, closer, moving toward the cabin. I stood up from the chair, gripping the knife with both hands, my body tense and ready to fight. Not again, I whispered to myself. Please, not again. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. The wind howled through the trees, but I could hear it, heavy breathing, low and deep, like a growl rumbling through the air. It was back. I could feel it. My eyes locked onto the broken door, waiting for the moment it would burst through. But it didn't. The creature didn't force its way inside this time. Instead, it stood there just outside, watching me from the darkness. I could feel its presence like a cold, oppressive weight pressing down on me. Then slowly, the sound of the footsteps retreated. They grew fainter, moving away from the cabin, back into the woods. I stood there for a long moment, listening until the sound disappeared completely. Only then did I dare to move. I stumbled back to the chair and collapsed into it, the knife slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. My entire body trembled with exhaustion and fear. It had left. Why? Why hadn't it attacked again? The answer gnawed at me, but I couldn't think straight anymore. The wounds on my arm throbbed painfully, and the adrenaline that had kept me going was finally wearing off. I needed to rest, but sleep felt like an impossible luxury. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, those eyes filled with hatred and rage. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it came back for me. God, I muttered, staring into the fire. What do I do now? The cabin was quiet again, the only sound the crackling of the fire. I was alone, with nothing but the fading warmth of the flames and the creeping dread that the creature was still out there, waiting. I knew I couldn't stay here. The cabin was no longer safe. The door was destroyed, the windows fragile, and there was no way to defend myself if the creature returned. I had to leave. But where would I go? The nearest town was miles away, and in my current condition, I wasn't sure I'd make it. But staying here meant certain death. That much was clear. I forced myself to stand, wincing at the pain in my chest and arm. I gathered what little supplies I had left, a few bandages, some water, and a flashlight. I didn't have much, but it would have to do. I couldn't afford to stay another night in the cabin. I had to move now, before the creature came back to finish what it had started. With one last glance at the cabin, I stepped out into the freezing night. The cold wind whipped through the trees, but I kept moving, one painful step at a time, hoping that somehow I could outrun the beast lurking in the darkness. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn was starting to creep over the horizon, casting a pale, gray glow over the landscape. My legs felt like lead, each step a battle against exhaustion and pain. My chest and arm were a mess of blood and torn flesh, but I had forced myself to keep moving, knowing that stopping would mean certain death. Ahead of me, the small cabin stood in eerie silence, its door hanging limply from the hinges. The sight of it made my stomach twist. Just hours ago, that place had been my sanctuary, but now it was nothing more than a wreck, a reminder of the nightmare that had unfolded within. I pushed forward, my breath ragged and shallow, until I stood on the cabin's front porch. The air was thick with the lingering stench of decay, the smell of the creature that had tried to kill me. Bloodstains marred the doorway and the ground outside, both mine and the creature's. It had bled here. I wasn't imagining that. I hesitated before stepping inside, scanning the dark corners of the cabin for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, no heavy breathing, no growls, just silence. It had left, but I wasn't foolish enough to believe that it was gone for good. I needed to clean up. I needed to get out of here, to get help, but first, I had to take stock of what was left. I walked gingerly through the door, surveying the wreckage. The table was shattered, chairs overturned, and broken glass littered the floor. The fire had long since gone out, leaving the cabin cold and dark. The only light came from the rising sun filtering through the cracked windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The first thing I did was head to the small first aid kit I had packed. I found it in the corner, miraculously untouched by the chaos, and began working on my wounds. My hands shook as I cleaned the deep gashes on my arm with disinfectant, wincing at the pain. The cuts were ugly and jagged, deep enough that I knew they'd leave scars. I worked in silence, wrapping gauze tightly around the wounds to slow the bleeding. The bandages weren't much, but they'd have to do until I could get to a hospital. If I made it that far. Once I finished, I sat down on the one remaining chair that wasn't completely destroyed, staring at the mess around me. My mind was still reeling, trying to process everything that had happened. The creature, the fight, the blood, it all felt like some kind of fever dream, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But the pain in my body reminded me that it was real. Every cut, every bruise, it was all real. I had fought something out there, something that shouldn't exist. And I had survived. Barely. I knew I needed to report this. Whatever this thing was, it was dangerous. I wasn't going to be the last person it came after. But as I sat there, staring at the wreckage, I realized how insane it all sounded. Who would believe me? What would I even say? I heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel, and my heart leaped into my throat. For a split second, I thought the creature had returned, but then I realized it was something else. Something far more familiar. A car engine. I hurried to the window and peered outside. A truck was pulling up the dirt road, its headlights cutting through the early morning haze. It was the sheriff's office truck, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I wasn't alone anymore. The truck came to a stop, and I watched as two deputies stepped out, followed by Sheriff Tom Hawkins. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with graying hair and a weathered face. I had met him once when I'd rented the cabin. He'd made small talk, warning me to watch out for bears in the area. He certainly hadn't mentioned anything about a monster lurking in the woods. The deputies stayed by the truck as the sheriff approached the cabin. He stopped just outside the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the damage and the bloodstains. His expression was hard to read, but I could tell he was trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "John Adams, right?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. "Yeah," I replied, my voice hoarse from exhaustion. He looked around the cabin again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the destruction. "You want to tell me what happened here?" I hesitated, trying to find the right words. How did I explain this? How could I make him believe me? "There was something," I said slowly, my voice shaking. "It broke in. It attacked me. I fought it off, but it wasn't human, Sheriff. It was something else." Sheriff Hawkins raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything right away. He stepped inside the cabin, carefully avoiding the debris on the floor as he moved closer. His eyes settled on the bloodstains, the gashes in the walls, and the broken furniture. I could see the doubt in his expression, the way he was trying to piece together a logical explanation for what had happened here. "Something else?" he repeated, his voice calm but skeptical. "Like what?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I don't know. It was big. Hairy. It looked like an animal, but it wasn't. It had claws, and it was smart. It knew what it was doing." The sheriff let out a long breath, rubbing a hand over his stubbled chin. "John, I'm going to be honest with you. This sounds like you had a run-in with a bear. Maybe a grizzly, based on the damage. It wasn't a bear." I snapped, my voice rising. "I know what I saw, Sheriff. This thing was something else. I stabbed it, I cut it, but it just kept coming. It was like some kind of monster." The sheriff exchanged a glance with one of the deputies, who shrugged. "Look," he said gently, "you've been through a hell of a night. I can see that. But we've been out here for years, and there's nothing like what you're describing in these woods. No monsters, no creatures. Bears, sure. Mountain lions, maybe. But nothing like what you're saying." My hands clenched into fists as frustration bubbled up inside me. They weren't going to believe me. No one was. "I'm telling you the truth," I said, my voice tight with desperation. "There's something out there. It's dangerous. It's not just some animal, it's something else. And if you don't do something, more people are going to get hurt." The sheriff sighed and looked around the cabin again. "We'll take a look around," he said, his tone placating. "See if we can find any tracks or signs of this creature. But I can't make any promises, John. These woods are full of animals. It's not unusual for someone to mistake one for something else, especially in the middle of the night." I wanted to scream, to grab him and shake him until he believed me, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. They were going to chalk this up to a bear attack, clean up the mess, and move on. And I'd be left with nothing but my scars and the memory of that night. "Fine," I muttered, lowering my eyes to the floor. "Do what you have to do." The sheriff gave me a small nod before stepping back outside, motioning for the deputies to start their search. As they walked away, I sank into the chair, the weight of everything crashing down on me all at once. They wouldn't find anything. The creature was smart. It wouldn't leave any evidence behind. I was sure of that now. I closed my eyes, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over again. The creature's eyes, its claws, the way it had looked at me before it fled. It wasn't over. It would come back. And when it did, no one would believe me until it was too late. For now, all I had were the scars, and the knowledge that the real nightmare was still out there waiting. After the sheriff and his deputies left, I sat alone in the ruined cabin, staring blankly at the bloodstains on the floor. The fire had gone cold again, but I didn't have the energy to stoke it. My body ached from head to toe, the deep gashes on my arm and chest still throbbing beneath the bandages. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the gnawing frustration that twisted inside me. They didn't believe me. I hadn't expected them to, not really, but facing their skepticism in person was worse than I'd imagined. I had told the truth, every detail, and yet it had been brushed aside, filed away as the ramblings of a terrified man who'd probably just tangled with a bear. A bear. If only it had been something so ordinary. I couldn't stay here. The cabin, once a place of solitude and peace, had become a prison, one that reminded me of the horror I had barely survived. With the sun now fully risen, the world outside seemed almost peaceful again, as if mocking me. But I knew better. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the woods, nursing its wounds and waiting for its next opportunity to strike. The sheriff's team had done their sweep of the area, and just as I had feared, they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of a struggle beyond what had happened inside the cabin. The bloodstains were dismissed as mine, and any evidence that the creature had bled was attributed to some wild animal that had likely fled the scene long before they arrived. They left me with a half-hearted promise to keep an eye out and advised me to rest up and get to a hospital if my wounds worsened. As if rest was even a possibility now. By mid-morning, I had packed up what little I had left that wasn't destroyed in the chaos of the night. My plan was simple: get back to town, find someone who might actually listen to me, and figure out what to do next. I wasn't about to sit around waiting for that thing to come back. I needed help, real help, someone who could take this seriously. I loaded the last of my things into my truck, pausing for a moment to take one last look at the cabin. The door still hung from its broken hinges, the window shattered. It looked like the scene of some bizarre crime, yet there were no police, no investigation. Just silence and disbelief. Maybe I'm the crazy one, I muttered to myself, climbing into the driver's seat. I didn't really believe that, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was starting to take root. I had been attacked by something I couldn't explain, something that shouldn't exist. But I had no proof, just my word against the impossible. As I drove down the long dirt road that led back to town, I tried to push those thoughts away. I needed to focus. Maybe there were experts, hunters, trackers, someone who had encountered strange creatures in the woods before. Maybe I could find answers somewhere else. The drive back to town took longer than I expected. My body was on autopilot, every mile blending into the next as I replayed the events of the night over and over in my mind. When I finally reached the edge of town, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I hadn't slept in over 24 hours, and the adrenaline that had kept me going was finally wearing off. The sheriff's office sat on the main street, a small, unassuming building that looked more like a glorified post office than a place of law enforcement. I parked the truck out front and took a deep breath before stepping out. My legs wobbled beneath me, and for a moment, I had to lean against the door to steady myself. The pain in my arm flared again, reminding me just how badly I needed medical attention. But that could wait. I pushed open the door to the sheriff's office and stepped inside. It was quiet, too quiet. A lone deputy sat behind the front desk, tapping away at a computer. He barely glanced up when I walked in. "I need to speak with the sheriff," I said, my voice hoarse and strained. The deputy finally looked up, his eyes widening slightly when he saw the state I was in. "You okay there, sir? You look like you've been through hell." "You could say that," I muttered. "Is Sheriff Hawkins here?" "He's out right now, but I can get a message to him," the deputy said, eyeing me with a mix of concern and suspicion. I shook my head. "I need to talk to him in person. It's important. It's about last night, the cabin." The deputy's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "You're the guy who reported the attack, right? Sheriff said something about that." "Yeah, that's me," I replied, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Listen, I know this sounds crazy, but that thing is still out there. I don't know what it is, but it's dangerous. And it's going to come back." The deputy nodded slowly, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. "The sheriff said he'd be checking the area. I'm sure if there's anything out there, we'll find it." "They didn't find anything because they didn't look hard enough," I snapped, my voice rising. "I told you what I saw, what I fought off. It's not a bear or some mountain lion. It's something else, something I can't explain. But it's real, and it's out there right now, probably looking for more victims." The deputy's eyes flicked toward the door, as if he were silently hoping someone would come in and rescue him from this conversation. But no one did. "I'll let the sheriff know you came by," he said after a long pause. "And I'll tell him what you said. But in the meantime, maybe you should get that arm looked at. There's a clinic down the road. Might help clear your head a bit." I clenched my fists, biting back the anger that threatened to boil over. They were humoring me. That's all it was, humoring the crazy guy who'd been through a traumatic experience and was now seeing things that weren't there. "Fine," I muttered, turning to leave. "But don't say I didn't warn you when something else happens." I stormed out of the office, my heart pounding with frustration and a growing sense of helplessness. The town looked so normal in the bright daylight, people going about their business, cars moving down the street. It all felt surreal, as if I had stepped into some alternate reality where monsters didn't exist, and I was the only one who knew the truth. I climbed back into my truck, staring blankly at the road ahead. I needed a new plan. The authorities weren't going to help me. They didn't believe me, and they wouldn't until it was too late. But I couldn't just leave it like this. There had to be someone out there, someone who could help me figure out what that creature was and how to stop it before it hurt anyone else. As I drove down the main street, the idea came to me. If the authorities wouldn't listen, maybe the press would. There were always reporters looking for a good story, and nothing sold better than tales of the supernatural. Maybe if I could get someone to write about it, someone with a platform, the sheriff's office would be forced to take it seriously. I didn't have any concrete evidence, just my word and the scars on my body. But maybe that would be enough to get someone's attention. One way or another, I was going to make sure that thing didn't get the chance to claim another life, even if it meant I had to face it again. Back at the cabin, the world felt heavier, the silence deeper. The sheriff's office had been a dead end, and I knew the moment I left town that I was on my own. The drive back to the cabin had been filled with a gnawing sense of dread, every mile pulling me further from any sense of safety and deeper into the unknown. Now, sitting in the half-destroyed cabin, I could feel the weight of my isolation. The walls seemed to close in around me, oppressive and suffocating, even though the door still hung broken on its hinges. The fire in the stove flickered weakly, struggling to stay alive, much like I felt at that moment. I was too exhausted to rebuild it properly, and the cold was seeping in through every crack and broken window. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't the wind that kept me on edge. It was the silence between the gusts, the quiet that seemed to stretch out like a void, waiting to be filled by something terrible. I lay on the small, battered couch, staring up at the ceiling, my mind replaying the attack over and over again. I could still feel the creature's claws tearing into my skin, its hot breath on my face, the terrifying weight of its body pinning me to the ground. I kept telling myself it was gone, that it had fled into the woods after our fight, but that didn't bring me any comfort. I knew it was still out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the thoughts, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jolt awake, sure I heard footsteps outside or saw movement in the shadows. My grip on the hunting knife, which I now kept by my side at all times, tightened every time my senses betrayed me. "Get a grip, John," I muttered to myself, rubbing my face with my good hand. "You can't lose it now. You need to stay sharp." But it wasn't that simple. The isolation was eating away at me. The sheriff hadn't taken me seriously, and now I had no one to turn to. No one who believed me. The sense of loneliness was overwhelming, like I had been cut off from the rest of the world and left to deal with this nightmare on my own. I stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness beyond the broken glass. The snow-covered ground glistened faintly in the moonlight, but there were no tracks, no signs of movement. It was as if the creature had never been there, as if the entire attack had been nothing more than a bad dream. But the pain in my arm and chest told me otherwise. The bandages were soaked through with blood again, the wounds refusing to close properly in the cold and damp. I hadn't made it to a hospital, too stubborn, too paranoid. I didn't trust anyone else to understand what had happened. But now, as the pain intensified, I realized that might have been a mistake. I stepped away from the window and sank back into the couch, wincing as my arm throbbed painfully. I couldn't stop thinking about the creature, about the way it had looked at me before it fled. There had been something in its eyes, something intelligent, something terrifying. It wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. It was something more. I shivered, though I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the fear. The fire crackled weakly, and I forced myself to stand up and add more wood to the stove. The warmth was faint, but it was better than nothing. I couldn't afford to let it die out completely, not with the creature still out there, lurking in the shadows. I had just settled back down when a noise broke the silence, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling sound, like something moving outside the cabin. My heart stopped, and I froze, straining to listen. There it was again, louder this time. Something was out there, moving through the trees, closer and closer to the cabin. My grip tightened on the knife, and I rose slowly to my feet, my eyes locked on the broken door. My heart raced in my chest, and my breath came in short, shallow gasps. I edged toward the door, every muscle in my body tensed, ready for whatever was about to happen. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the door creaked open, just a fraction of an inch, as if something was pressing against it from the outside. My pulse quickened, and I raised the knife, ready to strike. But nothing happened. The door remained half open, swaying slightly in the breeze. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the creature to show itself. But there was only the sound of the wind and the distant creaking of the trees. No heavy breathing, no growling, no claws scraping against the wood. Just silence. After what felt like an hour, I let out a shaky breath and lowered the knife. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me again. I backed away from the door, my eyes still fixed on it, and sat down on the edge of the couch, the knife resting in my lap. I didn't relax, though. I couldn't. My nerves were frayed, my senses on high alert. I knew the creature would come back eventually. It was only a matter of time. I leaned my head back against the wall, my body aching from exhaustion, but I forced myself to stay awake. I couldn't risk falling asleep, not now. Not when I was so vulnerable. The hours ticked by slowly, each minute dragging out like an eternity. I heard the occasional creak or rustle outside, but nothing that signaled the creature's return. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Why me? I whispered to the empty room, the sound of my own voice startling me. What did I do to deserve this? The silence offered no answer. I was alone, truly alone, and the realization hit me harder than I expected. No one believed me. No one cared. I was just another crazy guy ranting about monsters in the woods. I closed my eyes, fighting back the wave of despair that threatened to overtake me. I couldn't give in to it. I had to stay strong, had to keep fighting. But it was getting harder and harder to hold on. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from outside, snapping me back to attention. My eyes flew open, and I jumped to my feet, clutching the knife tightly. The sound had come from behind the cabin, from somewhere near the treeline. My heart raced as I moved cautiously toward the back window, peering out into the darkness. There, just beyond the reach of the moonlight, I saw it. A massive, hulking figure moving through the trees. It was the creature, and it was closer than ever before. My blood turned to ice as I watched it slowly make its way toward the cabin, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It was stalking me again, just like before. But this time, it wasn't in a hurry. It was taking its time, savoring the hunt. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling as I held the knife out in front of me. This was it, the moment I had been dreading. The creature was back, and this time, I wasn't sure if I had the strength to fight it off again. The door creaked open further, and I braced myself for the inevitable. I knew I couldn't run, not in my condition. The only option left was to fight. "Come on," I muttered under my breath, my voice shaking. "Let's finish this." The creature stepped into the light, its massive form towering over me. It let out a low growl, its eyes locking onto mine. And in that moment, I knew there would be no escape this time. It was all or nothing. With a deep breath, I raised the knife and prepared for the fight of my life. The creature's hulking form filled the doorway, blocking out what little light filtered into the cabin. Its glowing eyes were fixed on me, filled with the same malice I had seen the night before. It took a step forward, its massive, clawed feet crunching on the broken glass and debris scattered across the floor. My grip on the knife tightened, my knuckles turning white as I forced myself to stand my ground. This was it. This was the moment I had been dreading since that first attack. But I wasn't going to let it take me without a fight. "Come on, you bastard," I muttered through clenched teeth, trying to steady my breathing. "Come and get me." The creature let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that made my skin crawl. It seemed to sense my fear, feeding off it, savoring the moment. It took another step forward, its massive shoulders brushing against the broken doorframe. The air around me felt thick, heavy with tension. The fire in the stove flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the walls, but its warmth did little to comfort me. I couldn't wait for it to make the first move. I had to act now, before the terror that gripped my heart paralyzed me completely. With a shout, I lunged forward, the knife aimed at the creature's chest. But it was faster than I expected. It sidestepped my attack with surprising agility, and before I could react, its massive arm swung out, catching me across the side. The force of the blow sent me crashing into the wall, the knife slipping from my hand and skidding across the floor. Pain exploded through my body as I hit the ground, gasping for air. My vision blurred for a moment, and I could taste blood in my mouth. I groaned, forcing myself to push through the pain, to get back on my feet. But the creature wasn't giving me any time to recover. It advanced on me, its eyes burning with fury, its claws poised to strike again. I scrambled backward, my hand frantically searching for the knife, but it was too far away. "Damn it!" I hissed, my mind racing. I had no weapon, no defense. I was cornered, and I knew if I didn't think fast, I was dead. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the embers of the fire in the stove. Desperation surged through me, and I lunged toward it, grabbing a piece of wood from the pile and thrusting it into the flames. The fire caught quickly, the wood sparking and crackling as it ignited. I swung the burning log at the creature, hoping to drive it back. The flames licked at the creature's fur, and it let out a furious roar, recoiling from the heat. Its eyes widened in what I could only describe as surprise, as if it hadn't expected me to fight back like this. I didn't waste any time. I swung the burning log again, this time catching the creature across the side. Its fur smoldered, the stench of burning hair filling the cabin. It howled in pain, thrashing wildly as it backed away from me, crashing into the walls and overturning what was left of the furniture. I took the opportunity to grab the knife from the floor, holding it out in front of me as I slowly backed toward the door. "Get out of here!" I shouted, my voice trembling but defiant. "Go on! Leave!" The creature stumbled back, its massive form hunched over in pain. Its glowing eyes flickered for a moment, and then, with one last guttural growl, it turned and bolted out the door, disappearing into the darkness beyond the trees. I stood there for a long moment, my chest heaving, the knife still clutched tightly in my hand. My heart was racing, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. But the creature was gone. I had survived. Again, I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. The burning log smoldered beside me, the fire now reduced to embers. I had done it, I had driven the creature away. But I knew deep down that it wasn't over. It would come back. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but it would come back. And next time, I might not be so lucky. I stayed on the floor for what felt like hours, too exhausted to move. My mind was spinning, trying to process what had just happened. I had fought off that thing twice now, and each time it had nearly killed me. I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't stay here. I needed to get out, away from the cabin, away from the woods. But even as I thought that, I realized the truth. No matter where I went, the creature would find me. It had marked me somehow, and I was its prey. There was no running from it. But I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. I forced myself to stand, wincing at the pain in my ribs and the cuts that littered my body. I needed to get to safety, needed to find help. The sheriff hadn't believed me, and neither would anyone else in town. But I couldn't stay here, waiting for the creature to come back and finish what it started. I stumbled out of the cabin, the cold night air biting at my skin. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the snow-covered ground. I could still see the faint outline of the creature's tracks leading away from the cabin, but I didn't follow them. I turned toward my truck, my mind set on one thing: escape. I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I backed out of the driveway, my tires crunching on the frozen ground. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I drove away, the cabin disappeared into the distance, swallowed by the trees and the darkness. The road stretched out before me, winding through the woods like a snake, and I pressed down on the gas, eager to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But even as I drove, the memory of the creature lingered in my mind. Its eyes, its claws, the way it had hunted me. Those images would haunt me for the rest of my life. I knew I would never be able to forget, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever truly be free from it. As I neared the edge of the forest, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the distance, a dark shape, hulking and massive, slipping between the trees. My heart skipped a beat, and I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, urging the truck to go faster. But when I looked again, there was nothing. Just the empty road and the cold night. Maybe it was gone. Maybe I had finally escaped. But as I drove into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching me, waiting. And one day it would come back for me. No one would ever believe what had happened. No one would ever understand. All I had left were my scars, and the haunting memory of the creature that had nearly killed me. But I was alive. For now.